The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Mecia of the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today, I'm talking with John Short. John is what I consider to be a modern-day Charlotte Renaissance man. He has a bunch of really interesting things going on. He's the co-founder and co-host of the Charlotte Podcast, long-running local podcast before podcasts were much of a thing. He lives in Charlotte's Elizabeth neighborhood and organizes the yearly Halloween pumpkin wall. And he's also a big fan of Charlotte history. John writes the occasional historical heavyweight series in the Charlotte Ledger on Saturdays. We're going to talk with him about all that and more. John, welcome to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast.
Hey, Tony, thanks for having me.
All right, so I've been meaning to have you on for a while. My initial thinking was I would have you and Miller Yoho, who was your co-host on the Charlotte Podcast, and we sort of, reprise that a little bit. And my apologies to Miller, I didn't invite him on. I want to talk to you about some of the history stuff. But I mean, it was, you started that in, I think, 2015, 2016. You recorded, I think, nearly 300 episodes, which is amazing because, if you look at, most podcasts, they kind of like 75% of them like fizzle out within the first 5 episodes. People don't do anymore. And you kind of, I think, stake the flag early in Charlotte. But what was the thinking of the Charlotte Podcast?
Yeah, I think we were too dumb to realize we shouldn't be doing it and had no business being as authoritative as we were. But really, it came down to we both were fans of podcasts. We had written a little bit for local media publications and got to know each other through Twitter at the time, actually, and met in real life and kind of struck a rapport and then said, hey, there's no podcast out there talking about local issues. Why not us? I think really the fuel and what we were hoping to tap into in Charlotte in general was the fact that Charlotte as a community, there's a lot of really interesting people that are very accessible and willing to talk about the things they're building and excited to get the word out. And so we kind of matched that supply with the demand of folks willing to talk about the interesting things that they're working on, whether that is a nonprofit or a political leader to people doing cool stuff in sports and media. So yourself being one of those folks that we had on back in the day. So yeah, people being willing to come on and chat with us and our unique brand of silliness kind of kept it going.
I mean, Charlotte's just, I think, a really interesting place. So you have all these newcomers, you have people moving here from all over. There are a lot of people, and I've just learned just doing this podcast and working on the Ledger the last few years, there's so many people working in so many different ways on all these, whether it's problems or trying to make Charlotte better. I mean, what's your take on Charlotte?
Yeah, my answer to this question is very much tied to Charlotte's history, because when we write about the founders of Charlotte and the reasons that people over the centuries, which I always like to use when talking about Charlotte's history, centuries of history, is people moved to Charlotte because the cost of living was lower. They were tired of bad weather up north, and they were looking for a place where they could create a new life for themselves with more stable economic prospects, to create a home for their family, to raise their family in a stable environment. That is why people took the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania down to the Carolina backcountries in the late 1700s. And in 2025, that's why people move in here now, is because lower cost of living, better weather, great place to build a career, pay attention to your family, grow your family in a great community with all the resources that you want from a big city. So to me, that's what Charlotte is. And if you are willing to accept that that's what Charlotte is and what the priorities of city leadership have always been, which is kind of, hey, let's make sure that we're paying attention to the business community, kind of create a great area for businesses to grow and thrive here. Let's have just enough infrastructure around to make it feel like a big city, going back to Hotel Charlotte being built in the 1920s. We can talk a little bit about that. Always been the priority of leadership of Charlotte is, hey, let's just make this a nice place to live. And if you come down here expecting Miami or Chicago or New York, I hear some people say man, Charlotte's so boring. You can't get Ethiopian food at 2 a.m. I'm like, there's 3 places in the United States where you can do that. Your expectations are wrong. You don't go to McDonald's expecting to order a filet mignon. So don't come to Charlotte and expecting 2 a.m. Ethiopian food.
No, I agree. I love being in Charlotte, but it's just, it seems like we're always kind of striving. And I guess it's always good to want to improve yourself, but it seems like we aren't necessarily satisfied saying, hey, we're a good place to live with good weather. We're close to the beach, close to the mountains, and we've got just enough stuff for you to do. Like, that's not really,
Yes.
that's not like the Chamber of Commerce, like sales pitch necessarily, you know? It's like, we want to be the best at everything. Or we want to be world class. Like for a while in the 90s, are we a world class city? And there's a lot of angst about that. And maybe that's what any city like us does. But it just seems like, let's just acknowledge the reality and be comfortable in our own skin.
I mean, that's kind of my take. I see there's value, though, to kind of having a desire for self-improvement and being introspective. And if that turns into a list of things like, oh, we'll be world class if we can host a Super Bowl or host WrestleMania or get an F1 race or something, like, sure, like it's important to have aspirational goals, and just kind of don't let that turn into frustration because the place you moved for lower cost of living, great place to raise a family, better weather, does not have everything. I do think that is where it can get a little poisonous and putting it strong, but kind of it's when you obsess over a very specific slight from like a Taylor Swift's tour. Like, how many cities did she not go to, right? Let's not focus on that. Let's focus on our 3-day festival with Gwen Stefani, Weezer, and Dave Matthews Band coming back. That was a smashing success last year. I personally had doubts over that. Like, I don't understand why we can't focus on the positive of that and kind of obsess about kind of one particular tour, a big one, granted. But I don't know. There's for every Super Bowl we don't host, there are a number of great events that we do host that are unique to Charlotte, that are easy to get to, that don't sell out in the first 3 minutes, which I view as a good thing, right? Like, you can access all of this stuff. So would you rather go to 10 great events or one kind of world-class one? That's kind of the trade-offs that I think Charlotte teams often should be making.
No, I hear you. And we've had a lot of those big moments. You know, we had political conventions, we had the NBA All-Star game, we've had a bunch of those kinds of things. All right, I want to talk to you a little bit about Charlotte's history. And you touched on it a little bit. You know, you write this historical heavyweights column, series for us in the Ledger. How did you get interested in the topic of Charlotte's history?
So I'm from originally the Washington, D.C. area, and grew up close to Fredericksburg, Virginia, which, if you're familiar with U.S. history, Revolutionary War, Civil War history, very important area, kind of cradle of history. I grew up kind of minutes from George Washington's boyhood home, lots of presidential history around there. And just kind of grew up assuming that was the case everywhere, that everywhere celebrated their history. And I played sports in a district called the Battlefield District because it was all the Civil War battlefields. All the school names were named for Civil War battlefields. And moving to Charlotte, lived a couple other places too, but moving to Charlotte, I was like, man, there's not as much of a front and center emphasis on history. So I wonder, they're clearly, the city's been around for a while. There's clearly something going on here. So I just kind of started digging in on my own. Like, I'd see the historical markers around Uptown and read them and then just kind of continue to be curious and look it up later and learn more and more. Read a lot of Tom Hanchett stuff that he has written over the years and other historians and kind of dove into what they had written and came away surprised that these stories weren't being told in accessible ways. Like, you'd have to really hunt for information like that. You mentioned the podcast earlier. So part of the Charlotte podcast, one of the things that I was interested in doing and wound up doing for almost every episode is ending each episode with a history segment. So again,
I just want to interject. Like that was like you would really get amped up on those. Like, you just were excited. You could hear it in your voice. Like, oh, you won't believe this guy. Okay, here's what he did.
Yeah, it was genuine. It came from a place of actual excitement, just because I really do feel there's interesting, nationally relevant history and stories that are all around us in Charlotte that just don't get enough airtime, frankly.
Yeah,
the same way
Charlotte
they do
has
in
this
other
kind of
cities.
rap, and you hear it all the time. They're like, "Oh, does Charlotte really have any history? We knocked down our history, and what's going on?" And I mean, there is some truth to that. And I mean, in terms of knocking down buildings and replacing them with new bank towers or whatever. But there are actually, I think, as you're showing, some really interesting characters from over the last several hundred years here. What are some of your favorite characters?
Yeah, I think so. My favorite characters in terms of big personalities, I think some of the Charlotte founding fathers. One of my favorite stories that encompasses a couple of the founding fathers, Thomas Polk, Thomas Spratt in particular. There's a skirmish that in history, Charlotte's history, is called the Sugar Creek War. I'm not sure I've written about this with the Ledger before, but really that's just a skirmish between the original settlers of Charlotte with the British surveyors that came from like the Lord's Proprietor in order to just kind of do a survey of the land and see who owned what and kind of what taxes were owed. And what happened was really the founders of Charlotte roughed these guys up, broke their survey equipment, and kind of generally acted in a threatening manner to these guys. So I think that pugnaciousness, one, is important for considering the context of things like the Mech Deck. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but really kind of setting Charlotte apart from even in the central to eastern part of North Carolina. Like, we were like the backcountry settlers that kind of wouldn't take no for an answer. So going all the way back to the 1760s, that's one that stands out to me.
Yeah, I mean, that settlement period, I just think that period was a really interesting time because, you have, like you say, there are sort of these low grade kind of conflicts, with the British folks who were here, and then, you have people like, I'm just looking through some of the historical heavyweights that you'd written for us. You have like King Hagler.
Yeah. So King Hagler is a really important figure in Charlotte's history. Very relevant to the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. But he was the leader of the Catawba Indian tribe that was the kind of lived in the Charlotte area before the settlement from the folks who came down from Pennsylvania. He's referred to as King because that was his own designation. He was a very educated guy who sought to understand who these people were, these white folks showing up on their lands, understood their customs, and he learned that king is how the white people that were showing up identified their leader. So he called himself king in order to communicate that with the folks that were settling. So Thomas Polk and Thomas Pratt, folks like that. So he was friendly, other than relative to some of the other tribes. He kind of like saw these settlers to the area as potential allies in some of the other conflicts they had with other tribes in the area, and was generally very welcoming to the Europeans that settled the area. So really important guy that wound up kind of negotiating kind of hunting ground boundaries and helped the European settlers in the area kind of understand the lay of the land and even settled some kind of boundary, not necessarily disputes, but kind of like settled some boundaries that are now kind of a part of the North and South Carolina border. So really important.
The thing I love about the historical heavyweight series that you write for us is you really sort of introduce us to folks like this. And, a lot of these, early settlers, you got Thomas Polk, you had Ephraim Brevard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of times these are names that you see around town, but you have no idea who they are. Like, what is the Bar Street? Who's that name for? Or like, hey, I live in Dilworth. Where did Dilworth get its name? Where did Latta Park get its name? Those actually came from the same guy, right?
Yeah.
Dilworth Latta.
Yeah.
Anyway, and it's just sort of a nice introduction to that. And it's in like you say, a very approachable kind of way. And in a way that's interesting. It's not dry, old stuff. It's sort of like, hey, this is interesting. You try and put yourself in that, in their shoes, and say, okay, what was it like back then? What sort of, conflicts were they confronting? I mean, it was, so I think it's really interesting. Obviously, one of the big things in Charlotte's history that's, getting a lot of attention, especially now as we're headed toward May, is the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. It's 250th anniversary. This is a document that proponents of it, believers in it, say was signed in Mecklenburg more than a year before the Declaration of Independence, expressing, Charlotteans' desire to be separate from the British. A lot of historians don't necessarily believe that it actually happened, but we're coming up on the celebration of that. What's your take on the Mech Deck?
Yeah, I have two minds about it. I think socially and culturally in Charlotte, I think it's something to be celebrated. I think that I spent some time in Tampa, Florida, where they have every January a Gasparilla festival that is essentially Mardi Gras with pirates, right? And that celebrates a legend down there that Gaspar the pirate came and instead of taking over the city, decided to have a big party there, right? There's no evidence that actually happened, right? But it's turned into this great tourism event that is unique to the city and everybody celebrates. And I just love that. Like, everybody celebrating that does not care the historical veracity of the story and the reason why they party. So I believe that the Mech Deck, there's no reason the Mech Deck and the legend of the Mech Deck, if we can call it that, it can't be celebrated in the same way in the culture of Charlotte. And for many years it was. Now, back to kind of the historical accuracy. I'm no historian personally. I just really like looking into history. The controversy around Mech Deck is that there's no evidence you can point to today that the actual paper signed and written on May 20th and taken up to the Continental Congress actually existed.
It's not that there's no evidence it existed. It's
Sure.
that there's no contemporaneous document that currently exists.
Yes, that's an important caveat and clarification there. What I will say is that, and I've already referenced one of them, if you look at the context, I really think when talking about the Mech Deck, context really, really matters. I already mentioned the Sugar Creek War, which was the founders of Charlotte roughing up the British surveyors that came to town because they just didn't like the cut of their jib and didn't like, frankly, having an overlord an entire ocean away get to call the shots and tell them what taxes they owed. That happened in, I forget the exact year, but like 1768, like basically from the founding of Charlotte. This attitude persisted that we have settled this land. This was uninhabitable before we got here. Who are you to tell us how we can run our community? That an important contextual element of that as well is the predominant religious affiliation of these Charlotte settlers was Presbyterian. They had established themselves long enough that they wanted to educate the children that they had here because it's a great place to raise a family, if you remember that. So they kind of grew a community of children, started growing their families, wanted to educate them in the religious traditions that they themselves followed, as opposed to the Church of England. They set up a school. If you spend any time in Uptown, you know College Street in Uptown. That's where the school was. So hence the name College Street was where they established their Presbyterian college in order to educate their children. And they asked for an official charter from the Lord's Proprietor, kind of the British folks that oversaw the area. I believe it was George Selwyn Pub. Anyway, so they asked kind of his lackeys if they could get a charter for a Presbyterian school and were told no. That is a thing that was happening in this context of the broader narrative around American colonial independence, kind of all the stuff like Lexington, Concord, all those conflicts that would wind up cropping up in 75. Locally, this conflict over the school, and once again, overlords from across the ocean telling you how you can and cannot raise your children, what you can teach them, was very much kind of the tinder that was awaiting a flame to push back on.
So there's definitely evidence that people who lived here at that time were seriously PO'd against the British crown. The specifics of how that was expressed, maybe, there's some debate over that, but it's certainly accurate to say that that this area was happy with the way things were going.
Yes. And not only that, they had left the more polite society where the Tories and the folks that were more sympathetic to the British government, they had intentionally left those cities in Philadelphia and Massachusetts and those settlements that in the colonies up north that may have had commerce and trade relationships with the British. These are folks, they were pioneers. This was woods and muddy paths when they arrived here, right? And they have built a society independent of British trade. So they saw no reason to be nice and play nice with the British, right? So that, I think that context is really important because I think the predominant point of view from the other side, that kind of anti-Mech Deck wasn't real point of view, is like, why would they take such extreme measures to write this down? So not only does the document not exist in 2025, not something that you can tangibly look at, but what would be the purpose of that? And my argument is they had every reason in the world. If you know people and kind of like understand that frontier mentality, then that is very much context you need to understand why they would feel the need to take such extreme measures.
Well, that makes sense. And thanks for bringing that to life in the ledger and all the profiles that you do. Want to switch gears a little bit? Want to ask you about the pumpkin wall. You've been very involved with the pumpkin wall. What's been your role in that? What's the thinking on that? I mean, that's been around for a number of years. I don't think you were there at the beginning of it necessarily, right?
No, certainly not.
You're involved in it now. What does that involve? And what is it about that people seem to like?
Yeah, so you hinted at it earlier at the top. I live in the Elizabeth neighborhood, been there for over 12 years, very much consider it home. Great community, great neighbors. The Great Elizabeth Pumpkin Wall predates me joining the community for sure. We actually just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Pumpkin Wall this past year, 2024. It was started in 2004 by a group of neighbors, many of which kind of are still there and have held prominent roles in Charlotte leadership over the years. But it started out as a political message. So it was to celebrate the candidacy and kind of raise awareness of the candidacy of John Kerry, who was running for president in 2004. And the first sign said Kerry, was kind of like lit up with pumpkins on it. So it held its political leanings for a number of years before the Elizabeth Community Association took responsibility and made the Pumpkin Wall part of the events that we do in the neighborhood every year. And so we kind of dropped the political leanings there and made it a little more, I don't know, community focused, kind of.
Yeah, the messages lately have been more like unity, peace, equanimity, quietude, non-aggression. It's sort of it's a more of a unifying thing now. A political statement.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of political neutrality and focus on kind of bringing the community together. So my role, you asked my role, I view myself as the construction coordinator. So through volunteering over years, I learned kind of the finer points of the wall construction and how to take it from just a bunch of boards into a pumpkin wall and kind of the sequencing of things that need to happen with that. It wouldn't be possible to pull it off without the hard work of our social chair, number of volunteers coming together. The Elizabeth Community Association provides a ton of support and funding for materials for the wall. That's a 20-foot wall that's roughly 65 feet long.
Yeah, it's a neat tradition. I've been out and looked at it a few times. It's nice to see that, people bring their kids out there, and it's a sight to behold, and it's definitely a nice thing for Charlotte to have. All right, so in the few minutes that we have remaining, I'd like to revive one of the other traditions of the Charlotte podcast, which is to ask the guest a series of rapid fire questions.
I love it.
So, John, would you rather have a statue of yourself on Charlotte's Trail of History or have a major street named after you?
Oh, geez. Neither would be my preference. I think a street. Yeah.
Okay. Why the street?
I don't know. I feel like, especially in recent years, statues can go kind of wrong. Like, no matter how talented the artist is, it's that's a big risk, is having your face and physique preserved for eternity. If it goes wrong, that's a tough one.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. Next question. If you had a time machine, John, would you rather go back in time to May 20th, 1775 and get the real story about the Mech Deck, or would you rather be present for Charlotte's first NBA game at the old Charlotte Coliseum in 1988?
Oh, I'd love to see both. I think there's video evidence of the first Hornets game, so I can kind of mentally put myself there. I was there when they came back, when they brought the buzz back, so I kind of got a little taste of that. So yeah, for sure, being able to definitively say Mech Deck is real would totally be worth it. So got to go with that.
Okay. If you were to have a dinner party at a Charlotte restaurant, what 3 historical figures would you invite, and what restaurant would it be?
Oh, great question. You're doing this better than we ever did. Okay, restaurant. Let's go Fig Tree, little Elizabeth institution there, and 3 historic figures. Let's go Hugh McCall, because I think in the modern era, Charlotte wouldn't be what it is without Hugh. Count Rivafinoli, which I know is yours and one of our favorite historical figures. So he was a guy who was a very flashy manager of the mines that used to be in Uptown. So he kind of, legend has it, he would walk up and down
gold mines around Moorhead Street. Right?
That's right. So legend has it, he would walk up and down Moorhead Street with a cane and kind of like very fancily dressed. So those 2 guys, and then let's go Julius Chambers. So I think he's quite possibly the most underrated Charlotte historic figure, despite the fact that he does have a high school named after him. But very important guy, kind of broke a lot of barriers himself, important civil rights lawyer, kind of argued some really important, what we now consider laws in front of the Supreme Court, and did it all from an office here in Charlotte. So those are my 3.
Okay. And then final question. Podcast comes back. Would you rather have it be a weekly show recorded at Yafo, but only have a small, loyal audience, or one-time blockbuster reunion episode recorded at a packed night stadium that everyone listens to?
Well, we've experienced toiling in obscurity before, so I got that one under the belt. So let's go blockbuster night stadiums tour de force with just a number of guests and everybody on stage at once. That'd be fun. Kind of a nice little reunion of 6 years of doing the podcast.
It's okay. You're committed to it. You heard it here first.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
All right. John, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay. To our listeners, thank you for listening. The Charlotte Ledger podcast is produced by Lindsey Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.